Okay, great. Yes. So I'm Moritz Mendel. I'm a postdoc at Aalto. And first of all, I want to thank all of you and the organizers for including this paper in this amazing conference. So I will be talking about expectation formation, educational investment, evidence from labor market shocks. And this is joint work with Pedro, Alex, and Alessandro. So that basically the point of departure for this paper is that there is kind of like a well-established literature in economics that document or has documented how local economic conditions affect schooling choices in a wide range of different settings. So this has been shown in settings where there were housing busts. This has been showing with variation in local unemployment rates or sort of like some other kind of industry-specific shocks. So one potential mechanism via which these kind of like reactions of people may work is that people may adjust their subjective expectations in response to these local shocks. So the idea would be that people form kind of their subjective expectations with signals from their local economic environment, as opposed to kind of like forming expectations about sort of like the more rational way and like thinking about how this kind of like process evolves over time. So there has been a growing interest in understanding or in using like subjective expectations about returns to schooling in the literature to understand choices, as it has been realized that kind of like rational expectations are unrealistic in a wide range of settings where people make choices about their own education. And this is particularly true in settings where like the information required to get at these rational expectations may actually be hard to come by with, which may be the case in low and middle income countries in particular. Then people have kind of like started looking at subjective expectations as an alternative. However, there is limited evidence actually on like belief formation and on like the dynamics of these subjective expectations about returns to education. So there is an active literature in other forms of education, other forms of expectations in the economics literature, such as expectations about kind of like dropout probability or grades. But like on this kind of on this particular margin, there is limited evidence on how people actually form these expectations. And like something that we want to explore in this paper is the idea that people actually kind of observe some form of like signals in their local environment, take these like into account in some form and update their expectations. And like kind of like taking this at face value, the role of like subjective expectations, I mean, like this matters because schooling choices are in itself dynamic. And then like kind of if you have this dynamic choice, the kind of implication that the dynamics of the belief formation may have depends first of all on which signals people will take into account, and then how these signals may actually shape their choices in turn. So what we will do in this paper, or like we have kind of two research questions. First of all, we want to like investigate evidence for this like first channel. And in our case, we will focus on local unemployment shocks. So we are interested in like the extent to which people take these local unemployment shocks into account when they form expectations about returns to schooling. And then secondly, we want to depart from this first question and ask how do the dynamics of these like subjective expectations of returns to education actually shape attendance and graduation in secondary school. So essentially kind of like the chain of thought that we employ in this paper here is that we will start with these kind of local signals, which in this case is local labor market shocks. Then we will kind of like first investigate this arrow like to perceived returns to secondary schooling. So to what sense they shape expectations. And then thirdly, we kind of like want to take this like first mechanism and understand like what is the implication for educational investment. We will do so with panel data that we have. Okay, this is a bit. I go to more. Right, nice, okay. We will do so with panel data from Northern Macedonia that contains perceived returns to secondary schooling among poor households for 3 years. And this is a panel, so basically these people are repeatedly asked about their perceived returns to schooling. I will actually say a bit more about the particular setting in a couple of slides, but one thing that is important is there is sort of like low secondary schooling graduation rates among like poor households in Northern Macedonia. So we are speaking about like around only 60% of this population actually enroll in secondary school in the first place. And then in the next step, we will match this kind of, we will match these perceived returns to these perceived subjective expectations with variation in local unemployment rates that we construct with other data sources. And then the kind of two main, okay, now this is not working anymore. Okay, no. The kind of two main results is, first of all, in the reduced form evidence, we find that these local labor market shocks actually change or shape returns to schooling expectations. So if there is higher unemployment, people tend to believe or tend to update their expectations such that they expect higher returns after that. And this goes via people actually sort of revising the expectations of their wage with only like a primary schooling degree downwards by a larger extent and revising downwards their expectations for the secondary schooling degree. And then secondly, and this is kind of will be the main focus of this talk, given kind of like this conference, we will put this into a dynamic model of education choices with expectation updating, which will feature both sort of an attendance and a graduation and a dropout margin. And what we find there is that expectation updating actually matters. So like the dynamics of these expectations shape both attendance rates, enrollment rates, and graduation rates of people. Then we find that these sort of local unemployment shocks are associated with changes in graduation rates. And in particular, we find some evidence for these shocks being more relevant in some periods than in others. And then thirdly, in yet another exercise, we showed that like the differences, or like around 1/3 in the differences across in graduation rates across parental income can be attributed to differences in their belief formation process. Okay, I will quickly go over the literature, then I will quickly introduce the data, show sort of the reduced form evidence very quickly, and then go over to introducing the structural model. Okay, so just like I think like very quickly what we do here, so we kind of combine this like growing literature on expectation updating and subjective expectation that also people in this conferences have contributed to, with this literature on local economic conditions and educational choices. And the two kind of main contributions here is that we study how parents revise expectations in response to local labor market shocks, and then we incorporate sort of the findings from this first step into a second step where we then study these implications. Okay. So the context here is like Northern Macedonia. So primary education goes from 6 to 15, and then there is secondary education from 15 to 18, which is the usual one is like 4 years. So there is low enrollment, as I have like mentioned before already. This persists despite there being kind of like a mandatory schooling rate, but for like sort of enforcement of this compulsory schooling law is rather low. So you see a lot of people dropping out. So data is elicited in 3 different years, 2010, 12, and 13, from like a random sample of parents that are eligible for this conditional cash transfer. Yes? So like that's what I said, like it's the enforcement of this mandatory schooling is very weak. So you see a lot of people not actually going. Yes. Like we don't have perfect information on that, but yeah, like I don't have a perfect answer at this point. So not officially, I think, but probably like informally in a way. Yeah. Okay. So the way that we elicit these expectations is the following. So first of all, we ask about the probability of being employed at age 25. And then we ask like these 3 questions about wages at age 25. So we ask for the minimum, the maximum, and then for the probability to earn at least up to the midpoint. And then kind of like what we do is we invoke like some different distributional assumptions to derive like the distribution of earnings expectations. And most of the results are robust to using like alternative ways of specifying this. And its expectations are elicited for the youngest male in the household. And so doing this, we get it like expected income variance, and expected returns to secondary school, because we asked this both for primary and secondary school, and the expected return, and we just like get by differencing these two out. So these are just like pictures of these return expectations in logs. So I think the important thing to take away here is, so the red mark for the primary is actually like where the minimum wage is. So people are like on average, this seems to be very close to the minimum wage. So people have like some realistic anchor in mind here. However, and this I think is like the usual case for these subjective expectations, this is kind of like spread out quite far. So you have like a wide like set of heterogeneity in the population, and then you see that this kind of varies across the years. So there is quite some dynamics in there, and same holds for the secondary schooling expectations. Okay, so the next step is then that we construct this local unemployment rate as our signal. So what we do here is we estimate this local unemployment rate for each household as a weighted average of nearby unemployment centers. So we can kind of like observe the unemployment rate at these employment centers from administrative data. Then we proxy the active population with working age data. And then we geolink households and kind of construct weights for each of these unemployment centers for each household. And then we compute this distant weighted average as like their sort of like local unemployment over time. And we measure this each year. So this is a picture of Macedonia and these centers, which are like spread out quite evenly. And then for kind of an individual living there, we would kind of like take these like nearby centers into account and then average this up as like their local unemployment rate. Okay, this is just a distribution of this local unemployment rate. This is probably hard to see. So yeah, the color here is supposed to vary quite a bit. So essentially, I think the takeaway is that there is quite some variation in these unemployment rates. Okay, and this is just like sort of the distribution of these local unemployment rates in our sample over time. So what you can see is that this changes quite a bit over the kind of like period where people are surveyed here. And there is still sort of like wide variation across individuals that we see in each year. Yes. Okay. So now about like the reduced from evidence. So this is kind of the first step, and this is essentially now no belief formation part, but this is just like showing how do these expectations actually matter for outcomes that we care about. So in this sense, what we do here is we regress these expectations on the numbers of missed days in secondary school, so school absences. The reason we look at school absences here instead of kind of like the extensive margin is that we find these school absences to be quite correlated with kind of like choices like later on, such as dropout, but they're kind of like more intensive margin, so it's easier to kind of like detect effects from like smaller variation in beliefs. And what you can see here is that in the fixed effect model, we see that like kind of these expectations actually drive like attendance in secondary school quite a bit. Here, like in this case, we find that the expected primary income appears to be like a bit of a stronger driver of attendance rates than the secondary expectations. However, if I do the same thing for enrollment, where I cannot actually add fixed effects, the picture is the other way around. I think the main takeaway is that these expectations shape actual behavior in our sample. And then this is sort of the more important, the main equation here, which is now thinking about like how do these local unemployment rates affect expectations for both the primary and the secondary margin. And so the more important column is the third and the sixth one, because there we include this like Blundell-Bond instruments to account for the nickel bias. And so what we can see is that these local unemployment rates, they shape, in particular, the returns to primary education more than they do shape the returns to secondary education. So people take into account these shocks and update their expectations about like how much they can earn in primary school. Yes, okay, this is kind of like the second idea. Okay, so for now, all of this has been like mainly reduced from exercise. And we kind of have used sort of like a linear models to get at these together like sort of evidence for the channels that we're interested in. But now we want to take this a step further and also take this to a model. So what we want is kind of a more flexible model of these expectations. Because like if we have these linear expectations, we only nest like a sort of restrictive set of potential models of expectation formation. So what we like kind of wanted to do is have like a flexible model that maps kind of like this, both like the lagged expectations and this local unemployment rate into a distribution, into a joint distribution for secondary and primary expectations in the next period as like a flexible like expectation formation process that we can then plug into a structural model. So this turned out to be quite difficult because if you just use sort of the naive distributional regression approach where we just regress sort of like the probability of being in an interval on all these variables, what actually like what happens is that this kind of model maps into a lot of negative probabilities. Or like you just use sort of the CDF and like you have like a linear or like some form of approximation to that, and then you have like a lot of different points in the CDF that you like regress this on. There is, in particular, if you have limited data, there is this problem that you may like kind of like end up with negative probabilities pretty quickly. So we use this new approach that is from like a paper by Spadi and Stoli that is forthcoming in Econometrics that uses like the Gaussian representation to estimate the distribution or to estimate this like flexible distributional regression. So essentially, the idea is that we have like the GYX, which is kind of the Gaussian representation of this joint distribution. And then we have kind of like S, which is like a flexible function of the outcome, W, which is a flexible function of the control variables. And this is sort of the Kronecker product of these two. And this can then actually be estimated without having this issue, like without having these monotonicity problems. Yes, and basically the good thing here is also this maps into a convex problem. So this is actually very simple to estimate, even with like very kind of complicated specifications. Doing so, we kind of like can derive the full sort of like joint distribution given like all the kind of like covariates that we would look at. And this is just like one example now of what we get out of this. So this is like sort of the primary estimation for the secondary expectation. And essentially what we do here, so this is like for fixed lagged expectations. So they're just fixed in both of these pictures. And we just sort of vary the unemployment shock from 11% to 14% in both of these pictures. And what you can see is that here, like this is sort of consistent with the result that we had before. For this particular value of covariates, we can see that these unemployment expectations, the unemployment expectations have this kind of like negative effect on the primary, and they have sort of like not a lot of or no big effect on the secondary beliefs. The important thing here is the secondary beliefs sort of keep the primary beliefs fixed in this case, because otherwise, yeah, this is kind of just the way to get at this. It needs to be sort of like an iterative process to get the full joint distribution of these two. We're still kind of like trying to organize all these results, so you get like a lot of these pictures if you want. In general, it seems like there is not too much nonlinearities in the sense that people with sort of low lagged expectations or high lagged expectations would have like completely different ways of forming these beliefs. So there seems to be like a relatively large kind of like random component in like what beliefs they come up with in the next period. Okay. So this is basically all the ingredients now that we need. And now I go on to kind of like the dynamic model of education choices. So in this case, because we ask parents, so we kind of assume that parents and children are sort of one entity here. So there is no, yes. So you would say that potentially this is because there is, okay. No, it's a good question. I actually, so it may be the case because here, like magnitude, yeah. No, it's a good point. I should check. Yeah, no, that's a good point. Like it could be that they maybe I can look at these kind of like distributional figures a bit to get at that. It's a good point. Okay, so they are one entity. They choose the level of attendance and enrollment in each period in secondary school. So we modeled kind of the trade-off between completing secondary school to enjoy higher wages in the future, dropping out of school and receiving a lower wage today. So yeah, the two key features is choices are based on expected wages from both this primary and secondary school, and people kind of like update their expected wages via the unemployment shocks they receive. So the most important ingredients is here are, we have like 3 periods. People decide attendance and dropout, so they kind of like have 5 choices in total. They have like 1 of 4 attendance rates, or they have like the dropout decision. And then there is like, after period 3, there is a lottery that determines like high school graduation, which depends on their last period attendance. So actually this is 4 periods, but because we only have 3 periods of data, we kind of like, so 4 periods is secondary school, but we only have 3 periods of data, which is why we have 3 periods in the model. Then there is beliefs about age 25 wages, which like for primary education and secondary education. In this case, we will actually treat these wages as constant for now. So this is something that we still want to explore, whether this actually makes a difference. And then we account for like several different like state variables here. So there is human capital, which is just like the period in the model. There is the previous period's decision that is in the state space. There is these 2 expected wages. There is a local unemployment rate, and there is parental education. And then we also have like a couple of unobserved types, which depend on parental assets and like some municipality type that we need for some of the moments. And then we estimate this model using indirect inference. So this is just like basically the stylized version of this. So the way this works is like people start at a certain state ST. There is a realization of the local unemployment rate. There is a realization of shocks. People update their beliefs. There is this realization of taste shocks. People make their choice based on their new beliefs and based on their taste shocks. They receive some immediate rewards, and they will be in a new state where there is a new realization of unemployment rates. The important thing here is, and I mean, I will also get to that in the next slide, but people take their expectations here at face value. So people do not like form expectations about how their expectations will change, but like sort of the subjective expectations at one point in time is what we regard as sort of like their best guess at this point that they will use to make their choices. Okay, so if people decide to drop out and work, they receive their discounted lifetime value of their expected primary wage for the rest of their life. And then there is sort of the value associated with a certain like attendance level at each point in time. So there is sort of one specific utility for each attendance level. There is like a total schooling utility, and then for each attendance level, there is like some additional term. And in particular, this schooling utility also depends on your past attendance. So like the stock of attendance is important in the sense that if you attend very little in one period, then you're more likely to drop out or still attend little the next period. And this is something that we kind of like see in the model as well, and that we fit the model with. And so this is usually just like a very simple linear specification that we have here in each period that depends on the year itself and on your kind of like past experience that goes in there. And then in the last period, the expectations is essentially is like the utility that you get from your particular attendance rate plus sort of like the graduation lottery that you receive then. Okay. So about the transition and the shocks, so the expectations to the dynamics that we have in this model are derived from the distributional regression I had before. So remember here in this model, like in the state variables, we have we essentially have the local unemployment rate, we have the parental education, and we have the lagged expectations. And these are the 4 levels that go into these that go into our distributional regression. From this distributional regression, we can essentially, for each level of these covariates, we can derive like a full kind of like probability distribution of beliefs the next period. So we have a huge matrix that maps each kind of like state, each state into like a new probability distribution for this period. Yes. Sorry, again? Yeah. Okay, so if you drop out, you're drop out forever. And then secondly, kind of like it's about your stock of attendance. So if you attend a lot in the first period, it's very easy to attend a lot in the next period, and it's very easy to attend a lot in the third period. So that's kind of the dynamic. So this is the way we think about this in this model. Yeah. Okay, so essentially we have this like full matrix that maps each state to a probability distribution. So they take this as their best guess and do not form expectations about how these expectations actually change. Then we have like very simple extreme value taste shocks. And the graduation probability is also something that we estimate outside of the model based on each kind of observed attendance level in the last period. So this is kind of like a simple backward induction, simply because people do not form expectation about how their expectation will evolve. So as they just take this as their best guess, we just have this like big matrix that maps max expectations, or like maps their states into like next period probability distributions. But this is not like something that complicates the solution a lot here. So we can easily estimate this with indirect inference, and this is just like the standard procedure here. This is the set of moments that we use. So just to like quickly kind of explain how we think that the data actually identifies what we do here. So there is attendance and dropout by lagged attendance. So this is exactly how we want to get at this sort of like serial correlation, or this kind of like dynamics of attendance rates here. Then there is attendance or dropout by a tercile of return expectations. So this is sort of like how we want to get at this, flexibly get at this effect of return expectations on attendance or dropout, using just like an OLS coefficient, was like reducing kind of the complexity of this a little bit, because there is even people with very, very high return rates that will still expect to drop out. Then we have graduation rates by income, wealth, and like their spatial unit or municipality, coefficients of regressions of enrollment on expectations, and regression of attendance on expectations. So maybe this is also important in the first period of the data. Like we kind of like model this like as a dropout choice in the first period, but essentially like in the first period, everyone aged 15, so that is usually the age you would enter secondary school, is kind of eligible for the model. And each of these people then in the first period, by deciding to attend, would decide to enroll in secondary school, and by deciding not to attend, would not enroll. And this is actually a very important margin as well in this model. Then we have average expectations and average enrollment rate as a way to kind of like fix these things. Yeah, exactly. This is kind of important to keep the process aligned with how these things actually evolve. Another thing that is maybe important about the types, before I go on to the results, is so far the types are not explicitly featured in this expectation updating. The only way they are featured is that we make the first initial lagged expectation that we kind of initialize the model with. This depends on the individual's type. So there is like a little bit of correlation here, but like after that, the learning kind of does not depend on the unobserved type here. Okay. So this is our model fit. So far, most of the dimensions are fit quite well. I mean, this is like a rich model with a lot of parameters. So most of these things we can kind of account for. Okay, and now I show like sort of like a set of counterfactuals. So what we tried to do here was to compare sort of the baseline scenario to a couple of other kind of like very simplified and stylized belief scenarios. So what we do here in these like percentiles is essentially we fix the secondary expectation to its mean value, and then we vary the primary expectation from kind of like a very low value, which would be sort of a very high return. So the 75th percentile is like a relatively low value of primary, the fixed value of secondary at the 75th level of return expectations. And then we kind of like go up the distribution here. And what's important here, like what you can see is like that in the baseline, we just have like the expectation formation process that we get out of the data. What we can see here is that kind of like when these belief expectations go up, when people expect higher returns, they tend to graduate more, which kind of makes sense, but there is an upper bound here. And this upper bound is because there is types, there is this graduation probability. So there's a whole lot of other reasons of why people actually graduate or enroll in school, and we cannot, and expectations do not affect them. So we would still see people with very high expectations dropping out. And then this goes down as we go, like, as we sort of like follow the distribution. And the one important thing is in the baseline, one part of this dropout is actually generated by people with very low return expectations. So they are the ones in our model that are more likely to drop out. So we also don't see a lot of these people. So this is like also potentially slightly out of sample, but these are the people who are kind of like the ones who drop out of school. And the important thing is, this is basically the same figure for enrollment. So this was for secondary schooling graduation. So you see this is, I mean, in general, like between 60 and 70%. And then if you do the same thing for enrollment, the kind of picture looks very similar. And you really see that this appears to be generated by these people simply not enrolling in school in the first place. Okay. The next thing we do is we look sort of, or we kind of like see how these unemployment shocks in the model affect graduation rates. So the important thing here is that these unemployment shocks now, even if they're like the sort of the normal rate of unemployment shock that we would observe, is not large enough to shape beliefs in a way that you would see a massive effect. And also that would probably not be realistic. So what I do here is I just group the unemployment that I see in the simulated data in 3 different groups, like a low, middle, and a high value, and I compare the outcomes of each group. And I do this both in the period 1 and in period 2. And in period 1, there is not so much variation here. There is this enrollment choice, and there is a lot of other things that are going on. People have their type. Still, it's also slightly less costly to go to school. So these unemployment rates in this part don't seem to be very correlated with the overall graduation rate. However, then at period 2, actually, this seems to matter much more. So people actually receiving this higher unemployment shock are more likely to stay in school simply because they expect lower returns. Okay, and then finally, this is the last counterfactual simulation. There is the effect of increased subsidies by return expectations. So what I do here is I just simply increase the non-pecuniary schooling utility by a certain amount, and I look by like what is the group of people that would be drawn into education by doing this exercise. So I just increase schooling utility, and then for each level of return expectations at the beginning of the model, so because here I'm looking at enrollment now, I'm seeing how much would this change their baseline enrollment rates. And what I find here, or what we find here, is that the people with the lowest return expectations and the people with the highest return expectations are kind of more likely to be drawn in by that. So people with low return expectations, so this is the way we kind of explain this, they tend to expect lower payoffs from schooling. So these subsidies actually convince or are like a further argument for them to go to school. And then in this hierarchy, we start with people who already expect very high return expectations, and then have other factors why they actually cannot go to school. So this is sort of the current picture that we see here. And this is something we want to continue exploring to see how these dynamics, or in particular also these expectations, actually shape the effect of these policies. Okay. Yes. So yeah, that's a good question. So far we don't use it. We have used it for these reduced form regressions that I showed before, and there they don't seem to drive, like they don't seem to be driven so much by the unemployment shocks. But maybe it's a good idea to include them in the model in the first place. Yeah. Okay, that's a good point. Thank you. Yeah. So technically we have the full distribution of these beliefs, but so far we actually only use the means. That's another point. Okay. And this is the last counterfactual I do, and this is just taking like one other control variable that we have in our expectation data. In this expectation updating process is parental education. So we've tried that with different covariates, and parental education seems to be the one that shapes like returns and expectations in the most kind of unique way. So like assets, for example, just shift the distributions, but not so much the return expectations. It seemed to matter a bit less in total. So we used parental education as a further factor in this expectation updating. And we have expectations, or we have parental education both in the expectation updating and in this and then also in the direct like non-pecuniary schooling utilities. And what I do here is I shut off or I plot the baseline differences in the graduation rates, which is around 7 to 8%. And then in this counterfactual, what I do is I shut off this channel. I basically shut off like all the other reasons of why people from higher educated families would go to school more. And then what you can see is around like, yeah, a bit less than a half and a bit more than a third of the gap between like children from lower and higher income, higher and lower education backgrounds remain. So this expectation formation process seems to matter for actual like, yeah, schooling outcomes of these children. Okay, so that's all that I have. So just to conclude, what we do is we look at this kind of like, well, we gather some evidence for belief formation about returns to schooling. And we find that we use this reduced form and document that people actually take this local environment into account when they make these choices. Then we go on to kind of incorporate this learning process or this updating process into a structural model of education choices. And then what we find is that local labor market variation influences parental expectations. We find that this expectation updating drives kind of educational investment over time. And I'm very happy to hear any kind of like feedback on the model setup in general. I think this, so yeah, we kind of try to get at this expectation updating with this sort of more data-driven approach of this distributional regression and derive conclusions from that. And yeah, exactly. So any form of feedback on the model is very welcome. And the thing we're thinking about is kind of additional counterfactual simulations and ways to add to this model. Thank you very much.